My name is Lydia Davenport, and I'm 32 years old. For most of my life, I lived in the shadow of a legacy that wasn't my own, in a house that felt more like a museum than a home. I never imagined that the greatest humiliation of my sister's life would become the beginning of my own. It all started with a portrait, a painting that was supposed to immortalize her beauty but ended up revealing my family's ugliest truths, hanging them on a wall for the entire world to see. Before I tell you about the crushing silence in that grand drawing room, about the moment a single sentence from a stranger shattered a lifetime of carefully constructed expectations, I want you to understand the world I grew up in. Have you ever felt invisible in your own home? Like a shadow living next to a star? If you have, then you'll understand what it was to be the other Davenport sister. For as long as I can remember, my family operated on a simple, unspoken principle. The world values beauty above all else. And in our family, beauty had a name. It was Alice. My sister Alice was born looking like a final, perfect brushstroke. She had the kind of effortless grace that made people stop and stare, hair the color of spun gold, and eyes the blue of a summer sky. She was the sun around which our family orbited. My parents, Richard and Genevieve Davenport, saw her as their masterpiece, the living embodiment of their social and genetic success. And I was Lydia, the quiet one, the plain one, the one with the mousy brown hair and the face that was always lost in a book. While Alice was being fitted for party dresses, I was hiding in the library. While she was learning the art of charming conversation, I was learning Latin. We were two sides of a coin, but only one side was ever meant to be face up. My existence was one of quiet observation, of being the steadfast, reliable, and utterly overlooked background character in the dazzling play of my sister's life. And for a long time I accepted it. It was simply the order of things, as natural as the sun rising and setting. But that was before the artist came. That was before Theodore Moreau looked past the sun, and for the first time in my life, someone truly saw the shadow. To understand the magnitude of what happened, you have to understand my parents. My father, Richard Davenport, was a man who measured life in acquisitions. He collected companies, properties, and accolades with the same fervor. His crowning achievement, however, was my mother, Genevieve. She was a society beauty from a family with an old name but dwindling funds. Their marriage was a merger of his new money and her old prestige. Together they built the House of Davenport on a foundation of impeccable appearances. Their children were meant to be the final gleaming spires on that edifice. Alice was the perfect spire. I was, I suppose, a functional but unadorned gargoyle tucked away under an eave. The announcement came, as most important family announcements did, over dinner. The crystal glasses gleamed under the chandelier. The silver was polished to a mirror shine, and the food was arranged on the plates with architectural precision. My father cleared his throat, a sound that always signaled a proclamation. He beamed, his face flushed with a triumphant pride. I knew so well, a pride almost always linked to Alice. As you all know, he began, his voice booming slightly in the cavernous dining room, the Davenport name means something in this city. It means quality. It means permanence. He paused for dramatic effect, and it is time we immortalize that permanence. I have commissioned a portrait. My mother clasped her hands together, her diamond rings catching the light. Oh, Richard, you didn't. But her eyes were sparkling. She knew this was the culmination of a months-long campaign. Not just any portrait, my dear, he said, his gaze settling on Alice, who was practically vibrating with anticipation. I have secured the services of Theodore Moreau. A collective silent gasp seemed to be sucked from the air. Even I, who paid little attention to the art world, knew the name. Moreau was a legend, a recluse who painted so few portraits that each one became an instant cultural event. He painted titans of industry, royalty, Nobel laureates. He was known for his brutal honesty and his ability to capture not just a face, but the entire history and soul of his subject. To be painted by Moreau was not just to be seen, it was to be validated by history. He's agreed to paint Alice, my father finished, unable to contain his smile. He saw a photograph of her at the charity gala and his agent said he was intrigued. Alice let out a small, perfect shriek of delight. Father, you can't be serious. Theodore Moreau? My mother was already planning. The blue dress, I think. The one with the silk from Italy. It matches her eyes. We'll have it tailored. And her hair. We must consult with Antoine immediately. The conversation swirled around Alice like a cyclone. Dresses, lighting, location, the eventual placement of the masterpiece over the grand fireplace. I sat there, pushing a piece of asparagus around my plate, a familiar feeling settling in my stomach. It wasn't jealousy, not exactly. It was more a sense of profound otherness, of being a tourist in my own family. I was happy for Alice, in the way you are happy for a character in a story. Her joy was a spectacle to be witnessed, not shared. My father finally turned to me, an afterthought. Isn't this wonderful news, Lydia? A Moreau in the family. It will outlive us all. I manufactured a smile. It's incredible, father. Alice will be a beautiful subject. My choice of the word subject was deliberate, a small private rebellion. To me she was a person. To them she was an object to be captured, a beautiful thing to be owned and displayed. They didn't notice, of course. They were already debating whether a string of pearls would be too much. The weeks leading up to Moreau's arrival were a storm of frantic preparation. The house was scrubbed, polished, and aired as if for a royal visit. Alice was subjected to a regimen of diet, skincare, and fittings that would have broken a lesser mortal. She thrived on it, blooming under the intense light of my mother's focus. My role, as ever, was to be a supportive cog in the machine. I fetched fabric swatches, confirmed appointments, and made myself scarce whenever a decision was being made. It was during this time that I retreated further into my own world, the world where I actually felt like I existed, the university archive. I was a historical researcher, a job my parents vaguely referred to as Lydia's little hobby. It was there, amidst the scent of old paper and leather, that I felt most myself. I was working on deciphering the letters of a forgotten 17th century female botanist, a woman who had defied convention to pursue her passion. Her story felt like a secret I was privileged to uncover. My only real confidante during this period was my Aunt Beatrice, my mother's younger sister. Bea was the family's eccentric, a former professor of literature who had scandalously refused to marry well, choosing a life of books and academic debate instead. She was the only person who looked at me and didn't seem to see Alice's less impressive sister. I called her one afternoon, hiding in a dusty carrel at the archive. "The house is in an uproar," I told her. "You'd think the king was coming, not a painter." She chuckled, her voice warm and raspy over the phone. "To your parents, an artist of his stature is royalty, dear. It confers the one thing your father can't outright buy, cultural legitimacy. How is Alice holding up under the strain of being perfect?" "She loves it," I admitted. "She's in her element." "And you?" she asked, her tone softening. "How are you holding up under the strain of being ignored?" I swallowed, the truth of her words a hard little knot in my throat. "I'm fine, Bee. I'm busy with my botanist." "Ah yes, the lady of the flowers," she said. "A woman who found beauty in things others overlooked. Sound familiar?" She never pushed, but she always saw. Her validation was a quiet, steadying presence in my life. Another such presence was emerging, unexpectedly, in the form of Gavin, a librarian at the archive. He was kind, with gentle eyes and a shared love for the quiet hum of history. He didn't know I was a Davenport of the Davenports. He just knew I was the researcher who got excited about faded ink and watermarks. One afternoon he brought me a cup of tea without my asking. "You look like you're 1,000 miles away," he said softly. "More like 400 years, I smiled, grateful. "It's a long journey back." "Well," he said, his own smile shy, "let me know if you need a guide." It was a small moment, a simple human connection, but it felt more real than anything happening in the grand polished rooms of my home. It was a reminder that another world existed, a world where value was measured in knowledge and kindness, not in the perfect shade of a silk dress. The day Theodore Moreau was due to arrive, a strange electric tension settled over the house. My mother flitted from room to room, adjusting flowers and plumping cushions that were already perfect. Alice was in a state of serene readiness, as if she had been preparing for this moment her entire life. My father paced in his study, looking at his watch every 30 seconds. I had been instructed to remain presentable but inconspicuous. I chose a simple gray dress and retreated to my usual spot in the library, a worn leather armchair by the window, a book open on my lap. The doorbell rang, a chime that echoed like a summons through the silent house. I heard the murmur of voices, the heavy tread of footsteps. Then they were in the library, which had been designated as the informal reception area. I stayed in my chair, trying to melt into the scenery. Theodore Moreau was not what I had expected. I had pictured someone older, perhaps more flamboyant. The man who entered was of an indeterminate age, maybe 50, with a lean, wiry frame and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He had piercing, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. He wore simple, dark clothes that seemed to absorb the light around him. He moved with a quiet intensity, his gaze sweeping over the room, over the priceless antiques and curated bookshelves, with an expression that bordered on disdain. My parents fawned over him. "Mr. Moreau, an absolute honor to have you in our home," my father boomed, extending a hand that Moreau shook with a brief, firm grip. "We are so thrilled," my mother cooed. "May we offer you some refreshment?" "No," Moreau said, his voice quiet but resonant. It cut through my parents' effusive chatter like a knife. "I'd like to see the subject." Alice was summoned. She entered the library with a practiced grace, a vision in pale yellow. She smiled, a perfect, dazzling smile. "Mr. Moreau, it is a privilege to meet you." Moreau turned his full attention to her. The silence that followed was the most unnerving I had ever experienced. It stretched for what felt like an eternity. He didn't smile back. He simply looked. He walked around her slowly, his eyes narrowed in intense, impersonal scrutiny. He was not looking at a beautiful woman. He was examining a specimen. My parents watched, their own smiles frozen on their faces. Alice's composure began to waver, a flicker of uncertainty in her perfect blue eyes. After his circuit was complete, he stopped in front of her. "Turn your head to the left," he commanded. She obeyed. "Now to the right." She did. He let out a small, almost inaudible sigh. It was a sound of profound disappointment. It was then that his gaze, sweeping the room one more time, finally landed on me. I was still in my armchair, half hidden by a wingback, my book clutched in my lap like a shield. Our eyes met. I felt a jolt, a strange and terrifying feeling of being truly seen, stripped bare in a single glance. He held my gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable, his expression unreadable. Then he turned back to my parents. "The light in here is poor," he said dismissively. "I will return tomorrow morning at 10. We will work in the drawing room. Have her ready." He nodded curtly and was gone, leaving a trail of bewildered silence and the faint, unsettling scent of turpentine in his wake. My mother rushed to Alice's side. "He's an eccentric darling. All geniuses are." He was obviously captivated, but her voice lacked conviction. For the first time, a crack had appeared in the perfect facade of their expectations. And I, in my corner, felt a tremor of something I couldn't name, a premonition that the world as I knew it was about to be irrevocably altered. The next morning, the drawing room was prepared like a stage. Flowers were artfully arranged, furniture was shifted, and a large canvas on an easel stood in the center of the room like an altar. Alice was seated on a velvet chaise lounge, dressed in the magnificent blue silk gown, her hair styled, her makeup flawless. She was the picture of aristocratic beauty. My parents stood off to the side, buzzing with a nervous energy. I was there too, by my mother's unspoken command, standing near a towering bookshelf meant to be part of the silent, admiring audience. Theodore Moreau arrived precisely at 10. He strode into the room without a greeting, his eyes immediately finding the canvas, then Alice. He stared at her again. That same intense, unnervingly long stare from the day before. He circled the chaise lounge, he picked up a charcoal stick, then put it down. He walked to the window and looked out at the manicured gardens. The tension was suffocating. Finally, he turned to my parents, his face a mask of weary resolve. "I cannot do this," he said. The words dropped into the pristine silence like stones into a still pond. My father stiffened. "I beg your pardon? I cannot paint this," Moreau clarified, gesturing vaguely towards Alice. "Why not?" my mother asked, her voice trembling slightly. Moreau sighed, a sound of pure artistic frustration. "Madame Davenport, your daughter is lovely. She is a perfect specimen of conventional beauty. If I were painting a perfume advertisement, she would be my ideal model, but I am not. There are 1,000 faces like hers in every society magazine, polished, pleasant, and utterly devoid of any interesting complexity. I paint character, not decoration." My father's face was turning a dangerous shade of purple. "Are you insulting my daughter?" Alice's eyes filled with tears, her perfect composure crumbling into dust. She looked utterly humiliated. "I am stating a fact," Moreau said, his tone flat and devoid of malice. It was worse than an insult. It was an objective assessment. His eyes, sweeping the room in his impatience, landed on me once more, and this time they stayed. He walked slowly across the vast Persian rug, his footsteps unnervingly loud, until he was standing directly in front of me. I felt like a butterfly pinned to a board. I could feel my family's collective glare burning into my back. "You, however," he said, his voice now holding a spark of genuine interest. He tilted his head, studying my face as he had Alice's, but this time it was different. It wasn't an assessment of surfaces. It felt like he was trying to read the pages of my soul. "You have a story in your face. There is a sadness in your mouth, but a fire in your eyes. There's a world behind them. I will paint you." If he had detonated a bomb, the effect could not have been more explosive. For a moment there was just stunned, ringing silence. Then chaos. "Absolutely not," my mother shrieked, her voice shrill with horror. "This is preposterous. It's an insult." My father stepped forward, his fists clenched. "This is not what we agreed to. The commission was for Alice. You have wasted our time, sir. This is an outrage." Alice finally broke. A sob tore from her throat, and she fled the room, the sound of her weeping echoing down the marble hall. My own heart was hammering against my ribs. I was frozen, trapped between my family's fury and this strange, terrifying man's focus. I felt a bizarre, hysterical urge to laugh. All my life I had been the plain one, the invisible one, and now the most celebrated artist of our time had looked at the family jewel and me, the lump of coal, and he had chosen the coal. Moreau was entirely unperturbed by the storm raging around him. He watched my parents with a look of detached curiosity, as a scientist might observe insects. "My terms are not negotiable," he said calmly. "I paint what inspires me. Your younger daughter inspires me. If that is not acceptable, I will leave. And I assure you, the story of why Theodore Moreau walked away from the Davenport Commission will be far more damaging to your reputation than the story of why he chose to paint the unexpected subject." He had them. He knew it, and they knew it. The threat of a public scandal, of being seen as people even the great Moreau found too vulgar to work with, was the one weapon they were defenseless against. My father's face went from purple to a mottled gray. My mother looked as if she might faint. The choice was clear, a private humiliation or a public one. They chose private. "Fine," my father ground out through clenched teeth. "Paint her. But let's get this farce over with quickly." They turned their furious, betrayed eyes on me. In their minds, this was somehow my fault. I had orchestrated this. I had, through some dark, bookish magic, bewitched the artist and stolen my sister's rightful place. I was no longer just the plain daughter. I was the usurper. The sittings began the following day, and the atmosphere in our home turned from tense to toxic. The drawing room was abandoned. Moreau declared the library, my sanctuary, to be the only room in the house with an honest soul. The family treated me with a chillingly polite cruelty. They spoke to me only when necessary, their words clipped and cold. My mother would drift into the library under the guise of checking on the progress, her eyes sweeping over me with disappointment, letting out theatrical sighs. "The light in here is so dreary," she'd comment to the air. "It does a person no favors." Alice locked herself in her room. I would hear her crying sometimes, and the sound was a physical pain in my chest. She saw me as a traitor. My father avoided the library entirely, treating that entire wing of the house as if it were contaminated. The first few sittings were excruciating. I sat in the designated armchair, stiff and self-conscious, feeling the weight of my family's disapproval pressing down on me. I could barely meet Moreau's intense gaze. I felt like a fraud, an imposter in my own life story. I stared at a fixed point on the wall, my hands clenched in my lap, trying to make myself as small as possible. Moreau worked in silence for the first 2 days, making broad charcoal sketches on the canvas, his focus absolute. He seemed oblivious to my discomfort, but I later realized he was giving me time. He was letting the silence draw out the tension, forcing me to sit with my own feelings. The breakthrough came on the 3rd day. I had brought a book with me, one of my favorites, a collection of historical essays. I was holding it in my lap, my thumb stroking the worn cover, a subconscious gesture of self-soothing. "What is that?" Moreau asked, his voice startling me out of my miserable trance. "What?" "The book," he said, not looking up from his canvas. "What is it about?" "Oh, it's about the evolution of cartography in the late Middle Ages," I stammered, feeling foolish. I expected him to grunt and go back to his work. Instead, he stopped painting and looked at me, truly looked at me, for the first time since that initial shocking appraisal. "Tell me one interesting thing you've learned from it." I was so taken aback by the genuine curiosity in his question that I answered honestly. I told him about the concept of mappa mundi, how medieval maps were less about geographical accuracy and more about telling a theological story, with Jerusalem at the center of the world. I explained how they were maps of faith, not of land. I spoke for nearly 10 minutes, losing myself in the subject, forgetting to be self-conscious. When I finished, a little breathless, he was just watching me, a faint, almost imperceptible smile on his lips. "Exactly," he said, as if I had just confirmed a long-held theory. "They mapped what was important to them, not just what was there." He picked up his brush. "Now stay like that. The light is catching in your eyes." After that, the sittings transformed. He had found the key to unlocking me. He didn't ask me to pose, he asked me to talk. He drew me out on every topic imaginable. My research, the books I loved, my views on history, on art, on life. He listened with an unnerving intensity. He would ask sharp, probing questions that forced me to articulate thoughts I didn't even know I had. "Why this botanist?" he asked one afternoon. "What is it about her that fascinates you?" Because she was invisible, I found myself saying, the words coming out before I could stop them. She did groundbreaking work, but a man in her field published it under his name. She was written out of her own story. I feel like I'm trying to write her back in. Moreau nodded slowly, dabbing a brush in a spot of ochre. "Many people are written out of their own stories," he said. "It is a great tragedy." He began to share things about himself too. He told me about his childhood in a poor industrial town, how he was told his love for drawing was a waste of time. "They look but they do not see," he said, and I knew he wasn't just talking about his own childhood mentors, he was talking about my family. "They look at your sister and see a perfect vase, they look at you and see an empty space beside it. They are blind to the flower that is growing in that space, their loss." His words were a balm on wounds I hadn't even realized were still open. For the first time I felt like someone was not just looking at me, but was seeing the world from inside my own eyes. I was not plain Lydia, I was Lydia the archivist, the thinker, the historian, a person with a landscape inside her. During one of our last sittings, he paused and looked at me critically. "You are still holding back," he stated. "There is a final guard you have not let down." I didn't know what to say. He put down his palette. "Your family believes value is something you are born with, a set of features, a name. They are wrong. True value, true character is forged. It is built in the quiet moments. It is built by the books you read, the secret passions you nurture, the pain you endure and learn from. You have been forging yourself in the dark for years, while they were busy polishing the silver. Do not be afraid to own the result." He was giving me permission. Permission to be myself, permission to believe that the things I valued were in fact valuable. As the portrait neared completion, I began to feel a strange mix of excitement and terror. This painting was no longer just a painting, it was a testament, a declaration, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that its unveiling would be the beginning of a war. The day of the unveiling arrived cloaked in a tense, funereal gloom. My parents had planned to host a grand party to celebrate the completion of Alice's portrait. Instead, they were now presiding over a small funereal gathering. Moreau had insisted, "The work must be seen first by those it concerns," he'd said, but I knew it was a strategic move. He had, however, taken the liberty of extending 2 additional invitations, which my parents, exhausted by the whole ordeal, had numbly accepted. The first was to Simon Hudson, the most influential art critic in the country. The second was to a journalist from a high society arts journal. My family saw this as damage control. Moreau saw it as setting the stage. We gathered in the library. The finished portrait stood on its easel, shrouded in a sheet of dark velvet. My father paced. My mother sat ramrod straight on a sofa, twisting her rings. Alice was there, a pale ghost of herself. She had barely spoken a word to me in weeks. She stood by the window, staring out at the garden, her back to the room. When the guests arrived, my parents put on their public faces, all charming smiles and gracious hospitality. Simon Hudson, a small bird-like man with sharp eyes, greeted Moreau with a respectful nod. The journalist, a sleek woman named Isabel, watched everything with a cool, calculating gaze. Finally, the moment came. We were all arranged around the covered canvas. Moreau stood beside it, his expression calm and unreadable. "As you know," he began, his voice filling the silent room, "a portrait is a collaboration. It is a conversation between the artist and the subject. It is my belief that this conversation was a fruitful one." He looked directly at me, a flicker of something encouragement perhaps in his eyes. Then, with a simple, fluid motion, he grasped the edge of the velvet and pulled. The cloth slid to the floor. Absolute silence descended upon the room. It was so profound I could hear the frantic beat of my own heart. The woman in the painting was me, but she was a version of me I had never dared to imagine. Moreau had not painted me in a fine gown or a beautiful room. He had painted me in my simple gray dress, seated in the old leather armchair. But the chair was like a throne. One hand rested on a heavy, open book in my lap. The other was raised slightly, as if I were in the middle of making a point, my fingers elegant and expressive. The background was not the library, but a swirling, impressionistic blend of color and shadow, from which fragments of text, maps, and botanical drawings seemed to emerge. It was my inner world made visible. And my face. He had captured it all. The melancholy, yes, but also the stubborn curiosity, the quiet determination. He had painted the fire he'd seen in my eyes. They stared out from the canvas, not with beauty, but with a startling, compelling intelligence. The woman in the portrait was not pretty. She was powerful. Simon Hudson was the first to speak. He took a step closer, his sharp eyes scanning every inch of the canvas. He let out a long, slow breath. "My God, Theodore," he whispered, his voice filled with awe. "It's your magnum opus. It is a study not of a face but of a soul. The Davenport girl will be talked about for a century." He hadn't called me Lydia. He had given me a title, a place in history, just like that. The journalist was scribbling furiously in her notebook, a look of undisguised excitement on her face. I risked a glance at my family. They were frozen, their faces a mixture of confusion and shock. They were confronted with a value they couldn't process. This wasn't the kind of beauty they understood, but the critic's verdict had given it a stamp of undeniable importance. My father's eyes were wide, and I could almost see the calculations running through his mind, the fame, the value, the prestige. My mother stared at the painting as if it were a puzzle she couldn't solve, her perfectly manicured hand at her throat. But it was Alice's reaction that struck me to the core. She had turned from the window, and she was staring at the portrait with a raw, unguarded expression. The jealousy was gone, replaced by a look of dawning, devastating understanding. She was seeing not only the depth in me that she had never acknowledged, but the lack of it in herself that Moreau had so ruthlessly identified. In that moment, I felt a surge of pity for her that was so strong it almost buckled my knees, and then I looked back at the painting. I saw myself. For the first time, I truly saw myself, not through my family's dismissive gaze or my own insecure lens, but through the eyes of a genius who had seen something worth capturing. It was a moment of profound, earth-shattering self-recognition. Tears, hot and silent, began to stream down my face. My mother, recovering her senses, tried to seize control of the narrative. "Of course," she said, her voice a little too bright, "we always knew Lydia had a certain quiet charm. Moreau has a wonderful eye for bringing out a subject's hidden qualities." Moreau, who had been watching silently, finally moved. He stepped forward, his quiet voice slicing through my mother's insipid words. "No," he said, not loudly, but with a chilling finality. "You did not. You had a treasure in your house, and you used her as a bookend. This painting is not a tribute to your family's legacy. It is a tribute to the spirit you almost extinguished." He turned his back on my stunned parents and walked to me. He gently pressed a small stiff card into my hand. It was his private contact information. "Your sittings are complete, Miss Davenport," he said, his voice softer now, "for my ears only. My work here is done. If you ever decide you wish to leave the library, the world is much larger than you have been led to believe." And with that he nodded to the critic and the journalist and swept out of the room, leaving my family shattered and silent in the presence of a masterpiece that was both their greatest social triumph and their most damning indictment. Once the guests had departed, a new kind of silence fell upon the library, heavy, thick, and accusatory. The portrait, now titled "The Archivist" by Hudson, in his gushing praise, seemed to radiate a power that dwarfed everyone in the room. My father, who had been rendered speechless, finally found his voice. It was not a voice of wonder, but of rage. He turned on me, his face contorted. "What did you say to him?" he demanded. "What did you do? Did you manipulate this situation somehow? Fill his head with nonsense about your books?" It was the same old accusation, the same assumption that I was somehow devious, that my quietness was a cloak for some cunning ambition. For my entire life I had shrunk under that tone. I had apologized, I had tried to explain, I had made myself smaller to appease his anger. But something was different now. The woman in the portrait stared out from over my shoulder, and I felt as if she were lending me her strength. I met my father's furious gaze without flinching. My voice, when it came, was quiet, but it did not tremble. I didn't say anything to him that wasn't true. I said, I spoke about my work. I answered his questions. That's all. "This is a humiliation," my mother cried, her composure finally breaking. "He made us look like fools. That journalist, everyone will be talking." "They will be talking about your incredible new painting," I countered, a strange, calm logic descending over me. "They will be talking about the masterpiece unveiled in your home. Isn't that what you wanted? Fame? Permanence?" My father stared at me, nonplussed. He didn't know how to handle this version of me, the one that didn't cower. Alice, who had been silent this whole time, finally spoke. Her voice was a broken whisper, directed not at me but at our mother. "He saw her," she said, her eyes still fixed on the portrait. "But you never looked at me like that, either. Not really. You looked at me like I was a doll you were dressing up." With a choked sob, she turned and fled the room for the second time, but this time her tears felt different. They were not for her lost moment of glory, but for a lifetime of a different kind of invisibility. My parents were left gaping, their anger momentarily deflated by this unexpected attack from their golden child. I saw my opening. Without another word, I walked out of the library, leaving them alone with the truth on the wall. I went to my room and closed the door, my hands shaking. I leaned against it, my heart still pounding. Moreau's words echoed in my mind. "The world is much larger than you have been led to believe." I looked at my reflection in the mirror. The same mousy hair, the same quiet face, but something in the eyes had changed. A spark had been lit. I picked up the phone and called Aunt Beatrice. I told her everything, the words tumbling out of me. When I was done, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, her voice thick with emotion, "Oh, my brave, brilliant girl, it's about damn time. The question is, what are you going to do now?" I knew exactly what I was going to do. Moreau had insisted on a formal contract, which included a modeling fee to be paid directly to me, a detail my father had scoffed at but allowed. It was a substantial sum. For years I had dreamed of a research trip to trace the journeys of my 17th-century botanist through the archives and libraries of Europe. My parents had always dismissed it as a frivolous expense. Now I had the means. It would be my first definitive act of independence. I took a deep breath and made another call, to Gavin, at the library. "Hi," I said, my voice steadier now. "I was wondering if you were still free to act as a guide. Not out of the 17th century, but out of this house. Maybe for dinner." I could hear the smile in his voice. "Lydia, I'd love that." In the days that followed, the story broke. The Arts Journal ran a feature with a stunning photograph of the painting. "Moreau's Muse, the Scholar in the Salon," the headline read. The article was a sensation. It praised Moreau's genius for seeing past the glittering facade of high society to find a subject of profound intellect and quiet grace. My family was mentioned, of course, lauded for their patronage of the arts, but the subtext was clear. The hero of the story was the artist who discovered the hidden gem, and by extension the gem herself. The world didn't see me as the plain sister, they saw me as the archivist. My parents, ever the pragmatists, quickly adapted. If the world was going to celebrate me, then they would take credit for producing me. They began to talk about my scholarly pursuits with pride, as if they had always championed them. But their attempt to co-opt my story was too late. The narrative was no longer theirs to control, it was mine. A year can change everything. A year after the unveiling, I found myself standing at a lectern in a beautiful wood-paneled room at the Royal Historical Society in London. I was presenting my paper, the culmination of my research trip across Europe, on the life and work of the botanist who had been my invisible mentor for so long. The room was packed. My work, funded by the portrait fee, had led to a significant discovery, a hidden cache of her original drawings and a personal diary that finally irrefutably proved her authorship of the work that had been stolen from her. I was writing her back into history. My voice was clear and steady as I spoke, my passion for the subject evident. I felt no fear, no self-consciousness. I felt for the first time completely and utterly myself. In the second row, my Aunt Beatrice was beaming, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. And next to her sat Gavin, who had flown over to be here for this moment. His presence was a quiet, constant source of strength. Our dinner date had turned into another, and then another. He had fallen in love not with the Davenport girl or Moreau's Muse, but with Lydia, the woman who got excited about primary source documents and had a laugh that was surprisingly loud. My family's reaction to my new life had been a clumsy, fascinating dance of disbelief and attempted reclamation. My relationship with them was now conducted on my terms, defined by the firm boundaries I had learned to set. A few months after I had moved into my own small book-filled apartment near the university, my parents had shown up unannounced. They stood awkwardly in my living room, dwarfed by the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, looking utterly out of place. My mother held out a peace offering, a hideously expensive avant-garde sculpture. "For your new home," she'd said. "It will be a conversation piece." I looked at the twisted piece of metal. "I already have plenty of things to talk about, Mother," I said, not unkindly, "but thank you." I didn't accept the gift. It was a test, and I passed it. They wanted to furnish my new life with their values, to place their mark on it. I politely refused. They still called, of course. The invitations to their dinner parties were frequent. "Everyone is dying to meet you," my mother would say. "You're quite the celebrity." I would always politely decline if I had other plans, which I often did: a quiet dinner with Gavin, a late night at the archive, a weekend visit with Bea. I was no longer an accessory to their social life. I had a life of my own. The most surprising change had been in Alice. A few months after the unveiling, she had called me. Her voice was hesitant, I enrolled in a program, she told me, landscape architecture, at the university. I was stunned into silence. I was always good at sketching, remember, she continued a little defensively. In the garden. It was the only thing I ever really liked doing. I did remember. I remembered her beautiful detailed drawings of flowers and trees, drawings my mother had dismissed as a messy hobby. That's wonderful, Alice, I said, and I truly meant it. There was a pause. Then she said the words I never thought I would hear. I'm sorry, Lydia, for everything. I was so caught up in what they wanted me to be. I never even thought to ask what you wanted to be. He was right. He saw you. It was the beginning, not of our old relationship, which had been a fiction, but of a new, fragile one, built on a shared understanding of the gilded cage we had both grown up in. We started having coffee once a week, talking not as the beauty and the brain, but as sisters. As I finished my lecture in London to a round of enthusiastic applause, I felt a profound sense of peace. The portrait, my portrait, the archivist, was now on loan to a national gallery, seen by thousands of people every week. It had become a phenomenon. But its greatest work was not done on the museum wall. Its greatest work was done inside of me. My family had wanted a mirror, a perfect, beautiful reflection of their own ambitions. Instead, a brilliant, cantankerous artist had given me a portrait, a window into my own soul. He didn't change me. He simply held up a different kind of mirror, one that reflected the substance I had cultivated in the shadows, and he showed it not just to me, but to the world. For so long I believed that being underestimated was my curse, but now I see that it was a strange and powerful gift. While everyone was focused on Alice, polishing and perfecting her, I was left alone. I was given the freedom of being ignored. And in that freedom, I built a world of my own, a world of books and history, a world of substance and character. It turns out, my father was right about one thing. The portrait will outlive us all, but it won't be remembered as a testament to the Davenport name or to their legacy of beauty. It will be remembered as the portrait of a woman who was found in a library, a quiet archivist who, as it turned out, had a story worth telling. My journey taught me that your value is not determined by who sees it or when they see it. It exists independently, forged in the quiet hours you spend cultivating your own mind and your own spirit. The most important unveiling is the one that happens inside you, when you finally see yourself clearly and give yourself permission to be the subject of your own life. And sometimes you come to realize that the person who will finally show you your own true beauty, your own true character, has been there all along. It's you.